Regarding the permissibility of a man to marry more than one wife from the Islamic perspective, it is important we look very carefully at the position of this form of polygamy, or what we call polygyny, from the position of the Quran and the Sunnah, particularly in the context of the revelation of the Quran and the Sunnah. Islam did not introduce polygamy. Societies all over the world have been practicing different types of marital arrangements between men and women. And during the period of Jahiliyyah, or the pre-Islamic period, they had numerous forms of marriages and polygamous relationships going on. What Islam did was to restrict the practice of polygamy, prohibit certain forms of marriages, ensure certain rights, and at the same time, while permitting those forms of polygamy that were culturally acceptable, making sure restrictions were put to reduce and, if possible, prevent abuses within such marital arrangements. So one thing to bear in mind is that Islam did not introduce polygamy. Islam found polygamy already going on. And in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4, verse 3 of the Quran makes it very clear, in the context, particularly after the Battle of Uhud, of protecting the rights of orphans. It allows for the marriage of 2, 3, or 4, but the Quran goes on to say, if you fear you will not be able to do justice or be fair to multiple wives, then marry only one. The importance of justice has been emphasized by Islamic scholars and jurists, and this comes from a clear hadith of the Prophet, peace be upon him, where he says, if somebody is unfair to any of his wives, he will wake up on the day of judgment with half of his body falling off. In other words, it is considered a punishable sin on the day of judgment to be unfair to one's wives. While in Islam, marriage is encouraged, the rights of a spouse within marriage are compulsory. They are fard, they are obligations that must be fulfilled. And in Surah An-Nisa, chapter 4 of the Quran, Allah makes it clear, if you fear you will not be able to deal fairly, to be fair and just, then marry only one. Polygamy, therefore, in Islamic jurisprudence is not an obligation, it is not compulsory, it is not encouraged. It is merely permissible. Certain circumstances may encourage it, certain circumstances may discourage it, or even consider it prohibited. So the circumstances of every case would be what would determine whether it was something that would be encouraged, merely permissible, discouraged, or even prohibited, but it is never compulsory. It is up to the couples concerned to consider the maqasid and the objectives of marriage in Islam, the attainment of sakina, of tranquility, of mawadda and rahmah, that is love and compassion, and ask themselves whether a particular marital relationship would facilitate or undermine the objectives of marriage within the family and the Islamic framework. And based on this, various Islamic communities have differed and evolved ways of regulating polygamy to reduce or eliminate abuses. And so in some societies, such as Malaysia and a number of others, they have required the permission of the first wife as a condition to regulate abuses. Because if first wife considers the husband as incapable of meeting her needs, then how can the husband convince any that he'll be able to meet the needs of more than one wife? In other societies, the judge has been given the responsibility of officiating any marriage. And so what we find going on is taking precedent from the time of the Sahaba, where even when there was an existing ruling in the Quran, for example, the Quran requires the amputation of the hand as the punishment for theft. When during the Caliph Umar's period, he noticed that due to famine and difficulty, that punishment would end up hurting a lot of people who were forced to steal. Then he suspended the punishment for that period. This act of Caliph Umar is described as being in the public interest for the purpose of what is called maslaha or istihsan, where it's the juristic discretion regarding how to best protect the objectives of Sharia. So different societies have the right in Sharia to regulate marriage, to regulate divorce as they feel is most appropriate to their own contexts. In other words, it is up to a society what it wants to do with the inherited custom of polygamy as the Prophet found it already taking place. As the Quran was revealed, it was already taking place. It was a customary practice that the Arabs in those days and in many societies have had no problems with. But if Muslims in a particular environment feel they need to restrict these marriages or bring more regulations to divorce or put more terms in marital contracts, just as there were no restrictions regarding how you rode your means of transport, a camel or a donkey or a horse. If societies today feel that they need to put certain restrictions of age, they need to put certain restrictions on the qualifications before you can move with a particular means of transport, it is in the area of mu'amalat, and the society in consultation with the scholars have the right in the use of this principle of maslaha, public interest, saddu dhari'a, blocking the means to a haram or preclusion, or istihsan, juristic preference, in ensuring that the maqasid or the objectives of Sharia are maintained. A society has the right to modify laws to suit its own reality and to avoid abuses of the marital institution. So while in Islam polygamy is permissible, it is not prohibited, it is left to the society if they want to put more regulations on it than were left by the Quran and the Sunnah.